Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes, specifically focusing on the evolution of domestic law through the lens of historical fiction and literary analysis. The information provided does not constitute legal advice, nor should it be used as a substitute for the counsel of a licensed attorney. Laws regarding domestic relations have changed drastically over the centuries and vary by jurisdiction. Please conduct your own due diligence and consult with a qualified professional regarding any modern legal matters. Imagine it is 1850. You are a man of standing in a bustling New England town, but your domestic life is a hollow shell of resentment. You want out. In the modern world, you would simply file a petition, cite irreconcilable differences, and begin the process of asset division. But in the world of American historical fiction, and the reality that inspired it, seeking a divorce as a man was not just a legal hurdle. It was a form of social and professional suicide. We have been conditioned to think that history was a playground for men where they held all the power. But when we look at the gritty, meticulously researched pages of historical fiction, we find a different story. We find a labyrinth of fault-based litigation where a man had to prove his wife's moral turpitude or abandonment in a public forum, often risking his entire reputation in the process. Why did some of the most powerful fictional protagonists choose to live in misery rather than seek a decree? And more importantly, why does understanding this struggle change everything you think you know about the American family structure? Over the next 10 parts of this masterclass, we are peeling back the layers of the American legal evolution. This isn't just a history lesson. It is a deep dive into the potential outcomes of a system designed to keep the status quo at all costs. By the end of this series, you will understand the hidden mechanics of historical domestic law, the social stigma that acted as an invisible prison, and how these narratives still shape our cultural perception of fatherhood and marriage today. To understand the male experience of divorce in historical fiction, we have to start with the concept of the legislative divorce. Before the mid-19th century, in many parts of the American colonies and early states, divorce wasn't handled by a judge in a quiet courtroom. It often required an actual act of the state legislature. Think about the implications of that for a character in a novel set in the 1700s. To dissolve a marriage, a man had to have his private failures read aloud on the floor of a government assembly. This created a massive barrier to entry. In historical fiction, we see this play out as a high-stakes gamble. If a man failed to secure the vote, he returned home to a spouse he had publicly shamed, under a roof that was now a powder keg of resentment. The primary historical trend we observe in literature from the Revolutionary period through the Victorian era is the shift from divorce a mensa thura to divorce a vinculo matrimoniae. The first, often referred to as a divorce from bed and board, was essentially a legal separation. The man was still legally bound to support his wife, and neither party could remarry. In fiction, this is the ultimate limbo state. It's the tortured protagonist who is technically single but cannot move on, trapped by a law that views marriage as an indissoluble sacrament rather than a contract. The second, the divorce from the bond of marriage, was the rare full dissolution that allowed for a clean break. However, the requirements to reach this state were Herculean. Let's look at a case study of a fictional patriarch in the early 1800s. To win a full divorce, he would have to prove adultery, or willful desertion, for a period of usually 3 to 5 years. In the context of a story, this meant the man had to become a detective. He had to hire witnesses, who were often of low character, to testify against his wife. This created a secondary market of perjury and scandal. If the wife could prove recrimination, meaning she could show that the husband was also at fault, the divorce would be denied. The law essentially said that if both people were miserable and both had sinned, they deserved to stay together as a punishment. This is a recurring theme in American Gothic fiction, where the house itself becomes a character, a physical manifestation of a legal trap that neither side can escape. The financial potential outcomes for men in these stories were equally devastating. While we often focus on the lack of property rights for women during this era, the doctrine of coverture, we rarely discuss the debt of maintenance placed on the man. In many historical narratives, a man seeking a divorce was essentially signing away a lifetime of earnings. Even if he successfully proved his wife's fault, he was often still required to provide for her to prevent her from becoming a ward of the state. This wasn't alimony in the modern sense. It was a preventative measure for the community's tax burden. For a man in a historical novel, divorce didn't mean freedom. It meant a life of labor to support a household he was no longer allowed to enter. Furthermore, we must examine the social capital at stake. In 19th-century American fiction, a man's worth was tied to his domestic stability. A man who could not govern his own household was seen as unfit to govern a business or a political office. This is why you see so many characters in literature opting for the silent arrangement. They lived in the same house, spoke through servants, and maintained a facade of unity. The open loop in these stories is often the discovery of this facade. When we look at the case studies of characters in works like The Age of Innocence or similar period dramas, the fear of the publicity of the court is the primary antagonist. The court records of the 1800s were public, and newspapers of the time made a brisk business of printing the salacious details of divorce trials. For a professional man, the cost of the decree was the total loss of his public credit. In this masterclass, we are going to break down the three pillars of the historical male experience in divorce: the legal, the financial, and the reputation. We will see how case studies from North and South differed significantly. For instance, in South Carolina, divorce was virtually non-existent until the late 1800s, leading to a unique literary tradition of long-term separation, and the complex legal fictions men had to invent to pass on property to children of secondary unions. Meanwhile, in divorce mills like early Indiana or later South Dakota, we see the rise of the transient plaintiff, men who traveled across state lines to take advantage of shorter residency requirements and more liberal grounds for dissolution. By understanding these historical trends, you will see that the American dream of the nuclear family was often held together by a framework of legal steel that was as punishing for the head of household as it was for anyone else. We are moving beyond the surface-level tropes of historical romance to see the transactional reality of the past. This isn't just about the end of a marriage, it's about the birth of the modern American legal system and the long, slow, and often painful transition from fault to no fault that changed the trajectory of the American man's life forever. Prepare yourself, because we are going deep into the archives to show you how the shadows of these old laws still haunt our stories today. To grasp the sheer gravity of what a man faced in the mid-1800s, we have to look at the concept of the fault-based system through the eyes of a fictional protagonist we will call Arthur, a successful merchant in 1845 Philadelphia. In the world of historical fiction, Arthur represents the typical middle-class male who finds himself in an untenable marriage. Under the laws of that era, Arthur cannot simply walk into a courthouse and say that he and his wife have grown apart. The law did not recognize unhappiness as a valid reason for legal action. Instead, Arthur must prove a specific, egregious violation of the marital contract. This leads us to our first deep dive into the historical trends of the era: the evidentiary burden of adultery. In many historical narratives, if a man wanted a divorce, he had to provide what was known as ocular proof or overwhelming circumstantial evidence of his wife's infidelity. Imagine if Arthur has to hire a primitive private investigator or rely on the gossip of domestic servants to build a case. This was not a private matter. In the 1840s, the courtroom was a theater. Arthur would have to present letters, witness testimonies, and sometimes even physical evidence of his own domestic failure to a jury of his peers. The potential outcomes here were binary and brutal. If he won, he was a cuckold in the eyes of the town. If he lost, he was a slanderer. This creates a fascinating tension in historical fiction, because it highlights the man's vulnerability to public opinion. Furthermore, we must examine the doctrine of recrimination. This is a legal mechanic often overlooked in modern discussions, but central to the plot of many historical dramas. Recrimination meant that if Arthur's wife could prove that Arthur had also committed a fault, perhaps he had a temper or had been seen in the company of other women, the court would refuse to grant the divorce to either party. The logic of the time was that a petitioner must come to court with clean hands. If both parties were guilty, the law left them exactly where it found them, bound together in a perpetual state of legal and social warfare. This is why in so many historical novels, the male lead is obsessed with his own conduct, not out of a sense of morality, but out of a desperate need to maintain his legal standing should he ever need to file for a decree. Let us transition to the financial case studies that define this era of literature. In 2026, we look back at the 19th century and often assume men had total financial control. While the laws of coverture generally gave a husband control over his wife's property during the marriage, the act of divorce flipped this script in a way that modern audiences find shocking. If Arthur successfully sued for divorce, he might retain his assets, but he was frequently hit with permanent alimony or maintenance orders that were designed to be punitive. Because there were no social safety nets, the court's primary goal was ensuring the former wife did not become a public charge. In a fictional setting, this often means the protagonist is forced to sell his business or mortgage his family estate just to pay for the privilege of being single. It was a trade-off: your freedom for your fortune. Now, consider the step-by-step process of the legislative divorce, which remained a reality in several states until the mid-19th century. If Arthur lived in a state where the courts didn't have jurisdiction over divorce, he had to petition the state legislature. This involved drafting a private bill. Imagine the social pressure of having your marriage discussed by state senators. This required political connections, significant bribes, and a willingness to have your name printed in the legislative record. Historical fiction often uses this as a plot device to show the intersection of private life and public power. A man's ability to get a divorce was often a reflection of his political clout. If you were a man of no standing, the law effectively told you that your marriage was indissoluble. This brings us to the concept of the divorce colony. As the 1800s progressed, certain territories recognized that they could attract wealthy men, and the revenue they brought, by loosening their divorce laws. We see this in stories set in the mid to late 19th century where a character suddenly announces he is moving to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Indianapolis, Indiana, for 6 months. These were the original Reno. A man like Arthur would have to leave his business, move to a boarding house in a frontier town, and establish residency just to take advantage of a more lenient judge. This was a form of legal migration that created a massive divide between the social classes. The wealthy could buy a divorce through travel, the poor were stuck in their local jurisdictions. Another critical element to explore is the custody of children. In the early 19th century, the legal trend actually favored the father under the principle of paternal right. Children were viewed almost as property or labor assets of the father. However, by the mid-1800s, historical fiction begins to reflect the shift toward the tender years doctrine. This was the idea that younger children were better off with the mother. For a male protagonist, this meant that seeking a divorce almost certainly meant losing his children. In a society where a man's legacy was tied to his heirs, this was a deterrent more powerful than any financial fine. We see characters in historical fiction stay in toxic marriages specifically to prevent their children from being removed from the family home, or to protect their inheritance. Let us look at a specific scenario involving the year 2026 perspective on 1870s law. Today we view the 1870s as a time of Victorian rigidity, but in the legal world it was an era of massive upheaval. Men were increasingly being sued for cruelty. In historical fiction, this term is often used loosely, but legally it was very specific. A man had to prove that his wife's behavior made it unsafe for him to live with her. This was incredibly difficult for a man to prove without appearing weak or unmasculine to a 19th century jury. The case studies from this period show men attempting to use the defense of insanity or extreme emotional distress, which often backfired, leading to the man himself being institutionalized rather than divorced. The level of detail required to navigate these laws was staggering. A man had to document every interaction, save every letter, and maintain a facade of the perfect gentleman while living in a domestic war zone. This is why historical fiction often portrays these men as cold or calculated. The law required them to be. One slip in character, one outburst of anger, and their legal case for divorce would vanish under the weight of recrimination. But what happened when the law simply wouldn't budge? What happened when a man was so desperate for a way out that he turned to the shadows of the legal system? In the next part of this series, we are going to explore the dark world of the abandonment loophole and the rise of the Enoch Arden laws. We will look at what happened when men simply vanished to start new lives, and the devastating legal consequences that followed when the past eventually caught up with them. We are diving into the world of bigamy, assumed identities, and the high-stakes game of historical identity, theft that many men played just to find a second chance at happiness. The concept of the self-made man in American history is often romanticized as a journey of economic upward mobility, but in the gritty reality of historical fiction and the legal archives of the 1800s, it often referred to a man who literally remade his identity to escape a failed marriage. When the legal barriers to divorce were insurmountable, many men turned to a practice known as self-help divorce, which in plain terms meant desertion. In the year 2026, we have digital footprints, social security numbers, and biometric data that make disappearing nearly impossible. However, in the mid-19th century, a man could simply board a train in New York and emerge 3 weeks later in Chicago or San Francisco as a completely different person. This leads us to the fascinating and high-stakes world of the Enoch Arden laws, a historical trend that dominated the legal landscape of the late 1800s and provided the backbone for countless literary plots. Imagine a man named Silas, a protagonist in a fictional account of the Reconstruction era. Silas is trapped in a marriage that has become a site of emotional and financial ruin. Because he cannot prove adultery or extreme cruelty in a court that demands a level of evidence he simply does not have, Silas decides to vanish. This was not a rare occurrence. Historical trends indicate that desertion was the poor man's divorce. Silas leaves his home in Virginia, travels west, and assumes the name of a fallen soldier. He builds a new life, marries a new woman, and fathers a second family. The tension in these stories always hinges on the Enoch Arden statutes, named after the 1864 poem by Alfred Tennyson. These laws stated that if a spouse was missing for a specific period, usually 5 to 7 years, and was generally believed to be dead, the remaining spouse was legally allowed to remarry without being prosecuted for bigamy. The potential outcomes for a man like Silas were a minefield of legal contradictions. If Silas ever returned, or if his first wife discovered his new life, his second marriage would be declared void. His second set of children would be rendered illegitimate in the eyes of the law, and he could face criminal charges for bigamy. In the context of historical fiction, this creates a ticking clock. The man is always one coincidental meeting away from total ruin. We see this explored in the case studies of westward expansion narratives where the past literally rides into town on a stagecoach. The Enoch Arden laws were a double-edged sword. They provided a path to a second life, but they never truly severed the bond of the first. This is a deep psychological burden for a character, as they are essentially living a lie that the state only tolerates as long as the truth remains hidden. Beyond the act of vanishing, we must explore the step-by-step mechanics of the fraudulent divorce mills that began to pop up in the late 1800s. For a man who didn't want to disappear but couldn't get a legal divorce in his home state, there was the option of the constructive service loophole. Let us look at a case study of a businessman in 1880s New York. He wants a divorce, but New York only allows dissolution on the grounds of adultery, which he cannot prove. He travels to a jurisdiction like Indiana or Illinois, which at the time were known for their liberal residency requirements. He stays in a hotel for the mandatory 90 days to establish residency. Then he files for divorce. To satisfy the requirement of notifying his wife, he uses constructive service, which meant placing a small, obscure notice in a local Indiana newspaper that his wife in New York would never see. When she fails to appear in the Indiana court to contest the filing, the judge grants a default judgment. The man returns to New York with a piece of paper saying he is single. However, here is where the historical trend of jurisdictional conflict becomes a nightmare for the male protagonist. Many states refuse to recognize these migratory divorces. A man could be legally divorced in Indiana but still legally married in New York. This created a class of men known as legal ghosts. They were in a state of marital limbo where their financial obligations followed them across state lines, but their legal rights did not. In historical fiction, this is often the point of no return for a character. They have spent their savings on a legal process that their home state deems a sham. The financial data from this era shows that these fraudulent divorces were a massive industry. Cities that catered to these men saw a surge in hotel stays, legal fees, and administrative costs. But for the man, the potential outcomes were often tragic. If he remarried based on a migratory divorce that was later overturned, he faced the same bigamy risks as the man who simply deserted. This legal instability is a masterclass in how the lack of a federalized marriage law in the United States created a fractured reality for men trying to navigate domestic failure. It wasn't just a matter of ending a relationship. It was a matter of navigating a geopolitical puzzle where every state line could change your legal status. Furthermore, we must look at the impact on property and inheritance, a central theme in American historical fiction. For a man who had fled a marriage or obtained a questionable divorce, the question of his estate was a looming shadow. If he died while his first wife was still legally considered his spouse in his original home state, she could swoop in and claim a dower right to his new assets, effectively disinheriting his second family. This is a frequent plot point in the legal thrillers of the early 20th century that look back at the chaotic laws of the 1800s. The man's attempt to find a second chance at happiness often resulted in a legacy of litigation that lasted decades after his death. Step by step, the historical man was forced into a corner. He could stay in a miserable but legally secure marriage, he could risk his reputation in a public fault-based trial, he could flee and live as a fugitive from his own life, or he could engage in the expensive and risky game of migratory divorce. None of these options offered a clean break. The reality was that until the mid-20th century, A man was never truly free of his first marriage unless his spouse died. This created a society where many men lived in a state of constant surveillance, not by the government but by their own pasts. In historical fiction, this pressure often manifests as a character's obsession with legacy and the fear of the skeleton in the closet. The man is not just fighting for his personal happiness. He is fighting to keep his entire social and economic world from collapsing under the weight of a single legal document from 20 years ago. As we move into the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the other side of this coin. What happened when the man wasn't the one leaving? What happened when a man was served with divorce papers in an era where he was expected to be the absolute master of his house? We will explore the devastating social stigma of the discarded husband and the rise of the alienation of affection lawsuits, where men began to sue other men for stealing the love of their wives. This was an era of litigation where emotions were given a price tag, and a man's honor was weighed in gold. The transition from the man as the pursuer of divorce to the man as the defendant marks one of the most volatile shifts in American historical narratives. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a man being served with a petition for divorce didn't just face a legal battle. He faced a categorical assault on his masculinity and social standing. In the year 2026, we view divorce as a bilateral dissolution of a contract, but in the era of historical fiction, it was often framed as a breach of trust where the man had failed in his primary role as the protector and provider. When a woman filed for divorce, she was essentially declaring to the community that the man was incompetent or abusive, and the legal system of the time provided the man with a very specific, and often aggressive, set of tools to fight back. This brings us to the rise of the alienation of affection lawsuit, a legal phenomenon that treated a wife's love as a tangible property right held by the husband. Imagine a man named Thomas, a fictional industrialist in 1890s Chicago. Thomas discovers his wife has been spending an unusual amount of time with a local artist. In modern law, Thomas might seek a therapist or a mediator, but in the world of Gilded Age litigation, Thomas would turn to the tort of alienation of affection. This allowed a husband to sue a third party, the lover, for damages. The logic was rooted in the idea that the third party had stolen a valuable asset from the husband. This wasn't about the wife's agency. It was about the interloper's interference with the husband's rights. In historical fiction, these cases were the ultimate display of male dominance through the pocketbook. Thomas wouldn't just be seeking to end his marriage. He would be seeking to bankrupt the man who humiliated him. The potential outcomes of such a lawsuit were a spectacle of public shaming. To win, Thomas had to prove three things step by step. First, that there was a valid marriage with genuine love and affection existing between the spouses. Second, that this love and affection was actually alienated or destroyed. Third, that the defendant's malicious conduct was the controlling cause of that alienation. In the context of a story, this meant Thomas had to parade his own marital intimacy in front of a jury to prove how much he had lost. It was a bizarre paradox where a man had to show his emotional vulnerability to secure a financial judgment. Historical trends show that juries often awarded massive sums in these cases, not because they cared about the marriage, but because they wanted to punish the man who had violated the sacred boundaries of another man's property. Parallel to this was the even more salacious tort known as criminal conversation. Despite the name, this had nothing to do with talking. It was a civil cause of action for adultery. If Thomas could prove his wife had an affair, he could sue the lover for the act itself, regardless of whether the wife's affection had been alienated. In the fiction of the era, this is often where the man's honor is weighed in gold. The law allowed a husband to recover damages for the defilement of the marriage bed and the clouding of the legitimacy of his heirs. This created a high-stakes environment where the male protagonist used the legal system as a weapon of vengeance. However, the step-by-step reality of these trials was grueling. Thomas would have to produce servants, hotel clerks, or even paid spies to testify to the specifics of the infidelity. The data from these historical cases reveals that while men often won these suits, the social cost was a permanent stain on their own names. They were winners in the courtroom but losers in the court of public opinion, often depicted as the bitter husband who traded his wife's reputation for a settlement. We also need to address the social stigma of the discarded husband in historical fiction. A man whose wife left him was often portrayed as a figure of ridicule or suspicion. In a society where the husband was the undisputed head of the household, her departure was seen as his failure to maintain order. This led to the historical trend of the countersuit. If a wife filed for divorce on the grounds of cruelty or neglect, The husband would often retaliate with a cross petition alleging her own misconduct. This wasn't just a legal strategy, it was a survival mechanism to preserve his professional life. Imagine if Thomas is a bank director in 2026. A divorce is a personal matter. But in 1890, if his wife's allegations of his beastly temper became public, depositors might lose faith in his judgment. The narrative arc in these stories frequently involves a man trying to suppress the truth through legal intimidation, creating a pressure cooker of domestic secrets. Furthermore, let's look at the case study of the defense of condonation. This was a common legal tactic used by men in historical fiction to trap their wives in a marriage. Condonation meant that if a wife alleged a fault, such as an affair or an act of violence, but then continued to live with the husband or had intimate relations with him after the fact, the law considered the offense forgiven. In a fictional setting, you might see a man intentionally acting with kindness for a single evening or manipulating a situation to ensure they shared a room, solely so his lawyer could argue in court that she had condoned his behavior, and therefore lost her right to sue for divorce. It was a psychological game of chess where the domestic space became a legal battlefield. The man used the law to keep her captive, not out of love, but to prevent the loss of status that divorce represented. The financial potential outcomes for a man in these contested cases were a labyrinth of liability. Beyond alimony, there was the issue of suit money. In many jurisdictions, a husband was legally required to pay for his wife's attorney to ensure she had a fair defense, even if he was the one suing her, or if she was suing him. Imagine the irony for a character like Thomas. He is forced to fund the very legal team that is trying to strip him of his assets and reputation. This led to a historical trend of men attempting to hide assets or transfer property to male relatives before the suit was officially filed. Historical fiction often uses the hidden ledger, or the secret deed, as a plot device to show the man's desperation to retain control. Step by step, the process of a contested divorce in the early 20th century became an endurance test. The man had to maintain his business, manage his public image, and navigate a legal system that was increasingly becoming more sympathetic to women's claims of emotional cruelty. The shift from physical cruelty to mental cruelty in the law meant that a man could be sued for indignities that were purely verbal or psychological. For the male protagonist of a historical novel, this felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The rules of the house were no longer the rules of the land. What happens, though, when the legal system is bypassed entirely for something far more permanent and far more dangerous? We have discussed vanishing and we have discussed litigation, but we haven't touched on the ultimate end of a historical marriage. In the next part, we are going into the darkest corner of American historical fiction, the widowhood by design. We will explore the chilling historical trends of men who were accused of using the velvet divorce, the use of arsenic and accidents, to solve a marital problem that the courts would not. We will analyze how the impossibility of legal divorce drove some fictional characters to the point of no return, and the forensic science of the era that tried, and often failed, to catch them. We are moving from the courtroom to the coroner's office. In the shadow of a legal system that made the dissolution of marriage nearly impossible for the average man, a darker narrative emerged in American historical fiction and the true crime annals of the 19th century. When the legislative hurdles were too high and the social stigma too heavy, the ultimate potential outcome shifted from the courthouse to the graveyard. We refer to this as widowhood by design. This was the desperate, albeit criminal, alternative for the man who felt he had no exit. In the year 2026, our forensic capabilities are so advanced that the idea of getting away with a domestic crime seems like a relic of the past, but in the 1870s and 1880s, the science of toxicology was in its infancy. For a man trapped in a marriage that threatened his inheritance or his social standing, the lack of a no-fault divorce meant that death was sometimes the only decree the state would recognize without question. Imagine a character named Elias, a fictional land speculator in the 1880s. Elias has married into a wealthy family, but his wife has become an obstacle to his further ambitions. Under the laws of the time, if he divorces her, he loses access to the family fortune and faces social ostracization. If she dies, however, he becomes the grieving widower, a figure of sympathy rather than scandal. This leads us to the historical trend of the velvet divorce. Historical fiction often portrays this through the use of arsenic, which was ironically known as inheritance powder. Arsenic was readily available in any general store as a pesticide or a tonic. It was tasteless, odorless, and its symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, mimic common 19th century ailments like cholera or gastric fever. The step-by-step reality of Elias's plan would involve a slow, methodical administration. In the literature of this period, the horror is found in the intimacy of the crime. The husband is the one sitting by the bedside, playing the role of the devoted spouse, while providing the very substances that are ensuring he will soon be single. Case studies from the Victorian era show that many men were caught only because they became overconfident, attempting to move on to a second wife too quickly after the funeral. The forensic science of the era, such as the Marsh test developed in 1836 to detect arsenic, was the only thing standing between Elias and a clean getaway. However, many rural doctors were hesitant to perform autopsies unless there was blatant evidence of foul play, as it was considered a violation of the sanctity of the body. For the fictional male protagonist, the gamble was that the doctor's desire to avoid a scandal would outweigh his professional suspicion. Furthermore, we must explore the historical trend of the accidental death. In many frontier narratives, a man looking to exit a marriage without the shame of the courtroom might orchestrate a tragic mishap. A carriage accident, a house fire, or a drowning were frequently used plot devices. In the context of American historical fiction, these accidents served a dual purpose. They removed the unwanted spouse and protected the man's public honor. There were no insurance investigators in the modern sense to look into the 2026 level of detail regarding tire tracks or accelerants. If a man could play the part of the broken-hearted survivor convincingly, the community would rally around him. This created a chilling transactional reality where a man's acting skills were as important as his legal knowledge. Let us consider a case study of a man in a 1910s industrial town. He is a foreman with aspirations for political office. A divorce would be a death knell for his campaign. The pressure to maintain a perfect domestic facade leads him to the brink of a criminal solution. Historical fiction often uses this internal conflict to highlight the inhumanity of the laws. By making the legal exit so difficult, the state inadvertently created a vacuum where violence became a viable, if horrific, path to freedom. The potential outcomes for the man were extreme. If he was caught, he faced the gallows. If he succeeded, he lived a life of quiet prosperity, forever looking over his shoulder. This is the ultimate open loop in historical noir. The man who got away with it but can never truly enjoy his liberty. Another layer of this deep dive involves the medicalization of the wife. Before the refinement of divorce laws, a man with enough influence and a compliant physician could have his wife committed to an insane asylum. While not a permanent death, it was a social and civil death. In many historical novels, this is the male character's cold, calculated alternative to murder. By labeling a wife's desire for independence or her emotional outbursts as hysteria, the husband could effectively remove her from his life, take control of her property, and live as a bachelor in all but name. The step-by-step process for this was terrifyingly simple. 2 doctors' signatures and a petition from the husband were often all it took to disappear a woman into the labyrinth of the 19th century asylum system. From a 2026 perspective, these historical trends seem like the stuff of nightmares, but they were the direct result of a legal framework that refused to acknowledge that marriages could and should end when they became dysfunctional. For the man in these stories, the lack of a legal escape valve led to a pressure cooker of resentment that often exploded into tragedy. We see this reflected in the data of the era. As divorce laws slowly began to liberalize in the early 20th century, the rates of domestic poisonings and suspicious accidental deaths began to decline. The law finally caught up to the reality that a peaceful legal exit was a better alternative for society than a violent private one. But even for the men who stayed on the right side of the law, there was one more hurdle that historical fiction loves to exploit: the return of the dead. What happened when the man who thought he was a widower, or the man who thought he had successfully disappeared, found himself confronted by the ghost of his previous life? The legal and social consequences of a reappearing spouse were catastrophic, leading to some of the most famous plot twists in American literary history. As we conclude this exploration of the darkest exits, we have to realize that for the historical man, the battle didn't always end with a decree or a funeral. Sometimes the past was a living thing that could walk back through the door at the worst possible moment. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the legal chaos of the second family. We will examine what happened when a man's past and present collided, the laws of inheritance that could strip a second wife of everything, and the desperate legal maneuvers men used to protect their new lives when their old ones refused to stay buried. We are diving into the world of secret wills and the fight for legitimacy in an era where your first marriage was an unbreakable shadow. The collision of a man's past and present lives in American historical fiction often centers on the precarious legal status of the second family. In the year 2026, we have standardized inheritance laws and digital records that clarify kinship in seconds, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a man who had moved on without a perfect legal dissolution was building his new house on a foundation of sand. This historical trend is known as the cloud of bigamy. Even if a man genuinely believed his first wife was dead, or that his out-of-state divorce was valid, the reappearance of the original spouse could trigger a catastrophic domino effect. The potential outcomes for the man were not just social embarrassment, they involved the total disinheritance of his current children, and the potential for his second wife to be legally reclassified as a mistress in the eyes of the probate court. Imagine a character named Benjamin, a fictional timber tycoon in 1890s Washington state. Benjamin left a miserable marriage in Massachusetts 20 years ago, assumed a new middle name, and built an empire. He has a second wife and 3 children who believe he is a widower. In the world of historical fiction, the inciting incident is often the arrival of a letter or a person from the past. Under the laws of the time, if Benjamin's first marriage was never dissolved by a court with proper jurisdiction, his second marriage is legally a nullity from its inception. This means his second wife has no dower rights, no claim to his estate, and no legal standing to make medical decisions for him. The children of this second union, despite being raised in high society, are legally illegitimate. In many states during this era, illegitimate children could not inherit from their father if he died intestate, meaning without a valid and highly specific will. The step-by-step desperation of a man in Benjamin's position leads to the historical trend of the secret will. A man would visit a lawyer in a different county to draft a document that attempted to provide for his second family without explicitly admitting to bigamy. However, this was a legal tightrope. If the will was too vague, the first wife could contest it and win the lion's share of the estate. If it was too specific about his double life, it provided the state with the evidence needed to prosecute him while he was still alive. Case studies from the early 1900s show that men often use complex trusts or land transfers to male relatives to bypass the probate process entirely, hoping to shield their second families from the first wife's legal reach. Furthermore, we must examine the concept of the putatively valid marriage. Some states began to adopt laws that protected a second spouse if they entered the marriage in good faith, unaware of the husband's prior existing bond. However, this protection rarely extended to the husband himself. If Benjamin was found to have known his first wife was alive, he could be stripped of his property through civil suits even before a criminal trial for bigamy began. The historical data indicates that these legal battles often lasted for a decade after the patriarch's death, as 2 sets of families fought over the same assets. In fiction, this is the ultimate tragedy. The man's hard-earned success becomes the very fuel for the destruction of the people he loves most. Let us consider an imagine-if scenario set in 1915. Imagine if Benjamin tries to fix the problem by secretly filing for a divorce from his first wife now, decades later. To do this, he has to admit he has been living a lie. The historical trend of the curative divorce was a risky maneuver, where a man would attempt to quietly dissolve the first marriage while already married to the second. This created a legal paradox. The moment he successfully divorced the first wife, he was technically admitting that his current marriage was bigamous. To rectify this, many men in historical narratives were forced to have a second, secret wedding ceremony with their current wife the moment the first divorce was finalized. This step-by-step process of remarrying your own wife to fix a legal technicality is a recurring motif in the transition from the Victorian era to the modern age. Another critical element is the role of the private investigator, or the shadow man, in these stories. As the 19th century closed, insurance companies and wealthy families began to employ specialized agents to verify the backgrounds of men entering into high-stakes business partnerships or marriages. For a man like Benjamin, his past was a liability that could be monetized. Historical fiction often features the blackmailer who discovers the lack of a final decree in a distant state. The man is forced to pay a perpetual tax on his secret, a financial drain that often leads to the very business failures the man was trying to avoid. This highlights the transactional reality of the era. A man's legal status was a commodity that could be bought, sold, or destroyed by anyone with the patience to dig through county records. The impact on the children in these narratives cannot be overstated. In the early 20th century, the stigma of illegitimacy was a social death sentence. A man's fight for a valid divorce was, at its heart, a fight for his children's future. In historical fiction, we see men engaging in extreme legal maneuvers, such as adopting their own biological children from the second marriage, to ensure they have a legal claim to the estate. This step-by-step circumvention of the marriage laws shows the lengths to which the male protagonist would go when the state refused to provide a legitimate exit from a failed union. It was a world of legal fictions where a man had to be his own architect of legitimacy. We also see the historical trend of the double estate. Some men maintain two entirely separate households in different states, effectively living two lives simultaneously. This required a level of logistical precision that modern audiences find fascinating. Data from historical census records occasionally reveals these double lives, where a man is listed as a head of household in two different jurisdictions with two different wives. When the man died, the resulting legal explosion often required the intervention of the state supreme courts to untangle. These real-world case studies provided the raw material for the sensationalist novels of the early 1900s, portraying the man not as a villain, but as a victim of a rigid legal code that did not allow for human error or change of heart. The move toward more flexible divorce laws was driven, in part, by the need to resolve these chaotic inheritance issues. The state realized that it was better to allow a man to legally end one marriage and start another than to have thousands of citizens living in a state of legal uncertainty. However, during the period most favored by historical fiction writers, that flexibility did not exist. The man was always a fugitive from his own history. This creates a powerful open loop in the narrative. Even if the man is happy, he is never safe. The shadow of the first wife is always there, waiting in the wings of the law. But what happens when the first wife doesn't just want the money? What happens when she wants revenge, and she uses the most powerful tool available to a woman in the early 20th century? The accusation of desertion and non-support. In the next part, we are going to look at the rise of the domestic relations courts and the specialized police units that were formed to hunt down runaway husbands. We will explore the era of the lazy husband laws and the chain gangs where men were sent for the crime of failing to provide for a family they had tried to leave behind. We are moving from the high stakes of the boardroom to the gritty reality of the workhouse. The legal machinery of the early 20th century developed a sharp, predatory edge specifically designed to catch the man who thought he could simply walk away from his domestic obligations. As we transition from the 1800s into the progressive era, we see a massive shift in historical trends regarding how the United States government viewed the runaway husband. No longer was he just a social pariah. He was now a criminal fugitive. This era introduced the lazy husband laws, a series of statutes that turned domestic non-support into a misdemeanor or even a felony. For a man in a historical fiction narrative, this meant the end of the era of disappearing into the frontier. The state began to build a nationwide infrastructure to hunt him down, not out of a sense of moral justice, but to protect the public purse. Imagine a man named Harrison, a fictional character in a story set in 1912 Pittsburgh. Harrison is an ironworker who has reached his breaking point with a marriage defined by conflict and debt. He decides to take the traditional route of self-help divorce by boarding a train for California, hoping to start over under a different name. In 1850, Harrison would likely have succeeded, but in 1912, he is met with the rise of the Domestic Relations Court and the National Desertion Bureau. These organizations acted as a primitive version of the FBI specifically for family law. They publish photos of runaway husbands in newspapers across the country, turning every citizen into a potential informant. If Harrison is caught, the potential outcomes are no longer just a forced return home. He faces the workhouse. The step-by-step reality of the workhouse or the chain gang for non-support was a brutal economic cycle. Under the lazy husband laws, a man convicted of desertion was sentenced to hard labor. The state would then take the meager wages he earned from breaking rocks or building roads and send them directly to his abandoned family. This created a paradoxical situation where the man was forced to provide for a household he was no longer allowed to live in, through the most grueling physical labor imaginable. In historical fiction, this is often the moment of total degradation for the male protagonist. He has traded his freedom for a different kind of slavery, all because the legal system offered no middle ground for the dissolution of a failed marriage. Furthermore, we must examine the historical trend of the extradition of the husband. Before this period, states were often reluctant to spend money extraditing a man for a domestic issue. However, as the progressive era took hold, governors began to sign reciprocal agreements. If Harrison is found in Los Angeles, the state of Pennsylvania will pay to fly or rail him back to face charges. This changed the stakes of the runner narrative in American literature. The protagonist was now a fugitive in the same category as a bank robber. The law viewed his flight not as a personal choice, but as an act of economic treason against the community. Let us consider a case study of a professional man in 1920. Imagine if a doctor or a lawyer attempted to desert his family. The state didn't just want him in jail, they wanted his license. The historical trend of professional debarment was used as a lever to force compliance. A man was told that he could either return to his wife and pay his court-ordered maintenance, or he would never practice his profession again in any state in the Union. This created a class of men in historical fiction who were trapped in their identities. They couldn't move forward and they couldn't stay still. They became the hollow men of the early 20th century, living in boarding houses and working menial jobs to stay under the radar, constantly terrified that a routine traffic stop or a background check for a new job would reveal their status as a deserter. The data from this era shows a staggering increase in the number of men imprisoned for non-support. In some metropolitan areas, nearly 20% of the local jail population consisted of domestic deserters. This was the era of the alimony drone, a term coined by journalists to describe women who supposedly lived off the court-ordered payments of their ex-husbands. But for the man, the reality was the alimony jail. If a man fell behind on his payments, he was held in contempt of court. Unlike a standard criminal sentence, a contempt charge had no fixed end date in some jurisdictions. You stayed in jail until you paid. But, as historical fiction often points out with bitter irony, a man in jail cannot earn the money to pay the debt that put him there. It was a legal catch-22 that destroyed thousands of lives. The step-by-step process of the alimony raid is another high-retention plot point often used in period pieces. Police units, sometimes accompanied by the wives themselves, would storm hotels or workplaces where the husband was rumored to be hiding. These public spectacles were designed to humiliate the man and serve as a deterrent to others. For a man of the 1920s, his reputation was his primary currency. Once he was featured in a newspaper as a deadbeat, his career was effectively over. This led to a historical trend of men taking extreme risks to avoid the domestic relations officers, including fleeing to Canada or Mexico, or in some tragic case studies, committing suicide to escape the relentless pressure of the court. In the year 2026, we might look at these laws as primitive, but they were the precursor to modern child support and alimony enforcement. The difference was the lack of nuance. There was no consideration for a man's mental health, his actual ability to pay, or the validity of the reasons he left. The law was a blunt instrument. In the world of historical fiction, this era represents the peak of the state's intrusion into the private lives of men. The home was no longer his castle. It was a regulated site of economic production, and if he stopped producing, the state stepped in to take over his life. But there was another way the state intruded, and it didn't involve jails or chain gangs. It involved the mind. As the 1920s progressed, the legal system began to lean on the burgeoning field of psychology. Men weren't just seen as criminals, they were seen as defective. This led to the rise of the court psychiatrist in divorce and desertion cases. What happened when a man's desire for a divorce was treated as a mental illness? What happened when the court decided that a man's failure to love his wife was a sign of a disordered personality that required institutionalization? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to explore the era of mandatory counseling and the medicalization of the male ego. We will look at how the courts tried to fix marriages by force, using the threat of the asylum to keep men in line. We will dive into the bizarre world of the 1930s reconciliation clinics, where men were subjected to psychological pressure to stay in marriages that were beyond repair. We are moving from the physical labor of the workhouse to the mental laboratory of the early psychiatric courts. Get ready because the state is about to get inside your head. By the 1930s, the American legal system had reached a breaking point. The traditional methods of punishment, the workhouse, the chain gang, and the alimony jail, were failing to keep families together. As the Great Depression ravaged the nation, the state faced a new crisis. Thousands of men were deserting their families not because of a lack of moral character, but because of a total economic collapse. In response, a new historical trend emerged that transformed the courtroom into a psychological laboratory. This was the era of the reconciliation clinic and the court psychiatrist. For a man in a historical narrative set in the 1930s or 40s, his fight for divorce was no longer just about property or fault. It was a battle to prove his own sanity. The law began to suggest that a man's desire to leave his wife was a symptom of a disordered mind, and the state took it upon itself to cure him. Imagine a character named Julian, a middle manager in 1938 Chicago. Julian has followed every rule, worked through the depths of the depression, and found himself in a marriage that has become a source of profound psychological distress. When he attempts to file for divorce, he is not met by a judge interested in his testimony. Instead, he is referred to a court of domestic relations that operates under the new philosophy of therapeutic justice. Julian is ordered to undergo a series of psychiatric evaluations. The potential outcomes of these sessions were terrifying. If the court-appointed psychologist determined that Julian's desire for divorce was rooted in an emotional maladjustment, the court could withhold the decree and order him into mandatory counseling. In the context of 1930s fiction, this is the ultimate gaslighting. The state is telling Julian that his reality is a delusion and his unhappiness is a medical condition. The step-by-step process of these reconciliation clinics was invasive. Men were subjected to personality tests that looked for signs of constitutional inferiority or psychopathic personality. If Julian refused to participate or remained adamant about the divorce, he risked being labeled as incorrigible. This was an era where the line between a domestic court and a mental institution was dangerously thin. Historical trends show that judges often use the threat of a long-term psychiatric hold to pressure men into signing reconciliation agreements. These agreements weren't just promises to be better. They were legal contracts that gave the court oversight into Julian's private life, including his spending habits, his social associations, and even his intimate behavior. Furthermore, we must examine the role of the social worker as the state's primary investigator. In previous decades, a man had to fear the police or private eyes. In the 1930s and 40s, he feared the visit from the social service agent. These agents had the power to enter a man's home, interview his neighbors, and report back to the judge on his moral fitness. Case studies from this period reveal a system where a man's career could be destroyed by a single negative report from a caseworker who felt he wasn't showing enough contrition for his marital failures. For a professional man, this was a form of social surveillance that made the workhouse look merciful. At least in the workhouse, your mind was your own. In the reconciliation clinic, the state wanted your soul. Let us consider an imagine-if scenario involving the year 2026 perspective on 1940s therapeutic law. Today, we value therapy as a tool for personal growth, but in the mid-20th century, it was used as a tool for social control. Imagine if Julian is told that his career advancement depends on a clean bill of marital health from a state-appointed psychiatrist. This was the reality for many men in historical fiction who worked for large corporations or government agencies. A divorce was seen as a lack of stability, and the psychiatric evaluation was the hurdle they had to clear. If the psychiatrist noted that Julian had an aggressive personality because he wanted to leave a toxic situation, that note followed him to every job interview and bank loan application for the rest of his life. The data from these clinics suggests a high rate of technical success, meaning men stayed in the marriages, but a devastating rate of human failure. These were often called white flag marriages, where the man simply surrendered to the state's pressure to avoid institutionalization. In historical fiction, this creates a haunting subtext of quiet desperation. The man is physically present in the home, but he is a legal and emotional ghost, broken by a system that medicalized his need for a fresh start. This era also saw the rise of the collusion of silence. Because the psychiatric path was so dangerous, men and women began to work together to fabricate stories that would satisfy the court's need for a fault-based narrative, just to avoid the prying eyes of the reconciliation experts. The financial potential outcomes of this therapeutic turn were also significant. The cost of these mandatory evaluations and social worker visits was often billed to the husband. Even if he was the one being scrutinized, he was the one paying for the machinery of his own confinement. For a man of modest means, the psychiatric route to divorce was a path to bankruptcy. It was a luxury to be sane enough to get a divorce, and a crime to be too miserable to maintain the facade. This created a profound class divide in historical narratives. The wealthy could hire their own psychiatrist to provide a favorable report, while the working-class Julian was at the mercy of whatever overworked state doctor was assigned to his case. Step by step, the 1940s pushed the American man into a corner where his very thoughts were subject to legal review. This is the period where we see the birth of the modern concept of the midlife crisis, which the law at the time viewed not as a life stage, but as a dangerous deviation from the social norm. The historical man was expected to be an emotional rock, and any crack in that foundation was treated as a structural failure that required state intervention. The reconciliation clinics were the last gasp of a society trying to prevent the inevitable rise of the individual over the institution of marriage. But the 1940s also brought something else: World War II. The war disrupted the state's ability to monitor every household. It sent millions of men overseas, creating a geographical and legal distance that the reconciliation clinics couldn't bridge. As the soldiers returned, the old system of psychiatric control began to crumble under the weight of a new, battle-hardened reality. The men returning from Europe and the Pacific were not the same men who had been cowed by a social worker's clipboard in 1938. They had seen the world, and they wanted a different kind of freedom. What happened when the greatest generation returned home to find their marriages had withered in their absence? How did the legal system handle a million men who had been trained to fight when they decided to fight for their right to walk away? In the next part, we are going to explore the post-war divorce surge and the rise of the incompatibility defense. We will look at how the military experience changed the American man's perspective on domesticity, and how the law was forced to evolve to prevent a total collapse of the social order. We are entering the era of the veteran's divorce and the first real cracks in the fault-based system that had stood for centuries. The rules were about to be rewritten by the men who had just saved the world. The year is 1946, and the United States is witnessing a domestic phenomenon that historical fiction often portrays as the Great Unraveling. Millions of men are returning from the front lines of World War II, but they are not returning to the same world they left behind. This period marks a massive shift in historical trends regarding the male experience of divorce. The rigid, fault-based system that had survived for centuries began to buckle under the sheer volume of veterans who found their marriages had become unrecognizable casualties of war. In the year 2026, we look back at the post-war era as a time of suburban bliss and nuclear families, but the legal reality was a surge in filings that overwhelmed the courts. For the returning veteran, the potential outcomes of a divorce petition were no longer just about social status. They were about the right to reconcile their wartime trauma, without the added burden of a failed pre-war domestic contract. Imagine a character named Leo, a fictional staff sergeant returning to Ohio in 1946. Leo married his high school sweetheart in a frantic ceremony just 48 hours before he shipped out in 1942. They have spent 4 years communicating through censored V-mail. When Leo walks through his front door, he realizes he is a stranger to his wife, and she is a stranger to him. In the historical fiction of this era, this is the classic point of no return. Under the existing laws, Leo cannot simply cite the war as a reason for divorce. He still lives in a world that demands a villain. He needs a fault. However, the 1940s introduced a new legal concept that acted as a pressure valve: incompatibility. While not yet the full no-fault divorce we know today, some jurisdictions began to recognize that the extreme circumstances of military service had created an irreparable breach that didn't require a traditional sin like adultery or physical cruelty. The step-by-step process for a veteran like Leo was fraught with institutional hurdles. The military had its own set of regulations regarding the support of dependents. If Leo filed for divorce, he risked losing his muster-out pay or facing administrative penalties if his wife filed a counterclaim of abandonment. This led to the historical trend of the collusive divorce. In thousands of case studies from the late 1940s, we see a fascinating and somewhat surreal legal theater where husbands and wives would mutually agree to lie to the court. Leo and his wife would hire a single lawyer who would coach them on how to manufacture a story of desertion or mental cruelty. They would agree on who would be the plaintiff and who would be the defendant, often choosing the path of least resistance to ensure the judge would grant the decree. This was an era of legal fiction where the truth was the enemy of freedom. Furthermore, we must examine the financial impact of the GI Bill on the divorce landscape. For the first time, a massive segment of the male population had access to government-funded education and low-interest mortgages. This newly acquired economic mobility gave men like Leo the leverage to negotiate their exits. However, it also made them targets. In the historical fiction of the post-war period, the battle often shifts to the division of these new veteran benefits. Could a former wife claim a portion of the husband's GI Bill education stipend? Could she remain in the house funded by a VA loan after the marriage was dissolved? The potential outcomes were a nightmare of jurisdictional overlap between federal veteran law and state domestic law. Let us consider an imagine-if scenario set in 1949. Imagine if Leo's wife had taken a job in a defense plant during the war and had tasted a level of independence she refused to give up. The conflict in these stories isn't just about Leo's trauma. It's about the collision of two people who have both been fundamentally changed by a global catastrophe. The historical trend here is the rise of mental cruelty as the primary ground for divorce. Men began to use this as a catch-all category. If his wife refused to return to the kitchen, or if she challenged his authority as the head of the household, Leo's lawyers would argue that her behavior caused him such extreme nervous distress that his health was in jeopardy. From a 2026 perspective, this looks like a desperate attempt to maintain the patriarchy, but in 1949, it was often the only legal language available to describe a fundamental mismatch in life goals. The data from the post-war surge shows that by 1946, the divorce rate in the United States had reached a peak that wouldn't be surpassed for decades. This wasn't because people were less moral, it was because the war had acted as a catalyst, forcing the legal system to acknowledge that the old rules of indissoluble marriage were incompatible with a modern, mobile, and traumatized society. In fiction, this is often depicted as the end of innocence. The veteran isn't just divorcing a woman. He is divorcing the version of himself that existed before the war. The courtroom becomes a place where the hero of the battlefield is forced to become a petitioner for his own life. Another critical element to explore is the role of the Veterans Administration and the legal aid societies that sprouted up to help returning soldiers. For a man of modest means, the cost of a contested divorce remained a barrier. The historical trend of the pro bono veterans lawyer became a staple of the era. These lawyers were the architects of the modern domestic practice, finding loopholes and creating precedents that would eventually lead to the legislative reforms of the 1960s. They navigated the step-by-step complexities of service of process on spouses who had moved across the country for war work, and they fought the social stigma that still labeled a divorced veteran as a broken man. In this deep dive, we also see the emergence of the long-distance divorce. During the war, many men had been stationed in places like Nevada or Florida, where residency requirements were lax. Upon returning home, some veterans attempted to use their temporary military residency to file for out-of-state divorces. This created a second wave of jurisdictional chaos, similar to the 19th century divorce mills, but on a much larger scale. The case studies from this period involve men who thought they were free, only to find that their home states refused to recognize the decrees granted by a judge in a city they had only visited while wearing a uniform. It was a period of legal instability that mirrored the emotional instability of the nation. Step by step, the 1950s began to settle into a facade of domestic stability, but the cracks were permanent. The veterans' experience had proven that the state could not force people to stay together through sheer willpower and legal threats. The historical man of the mid-century was caught between the old world of fault and the new world of personal fulfillment. This tension is the heart of the great American novels of the 1950s, where the suburban dream is often revealed to be a prison maintained by the threat of legal and social ruin. But as the 1950s gave way to the 60s, the pressure for a complete overhaul of the system became an unstoppable force. The era of the collusive lie and the manufactured sin was coming to an end. We are approaching the final chapter of this masterclass, where the legal walls finally come down. In the next part, we are going to explore the birth of no-fault divorce and the California Revolution of 1969. We will look at how the role of the man in the divorce court was transformed from a combatant to a participant, the rise of modern joint custody, and the final legacy of these historical struggles on the men of 2026. We are closing the loop on 5 centuries of domestic law to see how the ghost of the historical husband still influences the modern courtroom. Prepare for the final deep dive into the revolution that changed everything. The transition from the post-war era of collusive lies to the modern landscape of domestic law represents the most significant legal pivot in the history of the American male experience. As we reach the final part of this masterclass, we are focusing on the California Revolution of 1969 and the subsequent ripples that redefine the potential outcomes for men across the United States. In the year 2026, the concept of no-fault divorce is so deeply ingrained in our society that it is difficult to imagine a world where a man had to prove a crime to earn his freedom. However, the move toward this system was not a sudden act of benevolence. It was a pragmatic response to a legal system that had become a farce. By the late 1960s, judges, lawyers, and even the clergy realized that forcing men to manufacture sins was destroying the integrity of the judicial branch itself. Imagine a character named Robert, a fictional executive in 1968 Los Angeles. Robert is the culmination of every historical struggle we have discussed. He is successful, he is a father, and he is trapped in a marriage that has long since ended in everything but name. Under the old rules, Robert would have had to hire a private investigator to stage a photograph of his wife in a compromising position or admit to a fault he did not commit. But in 1969, Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act. This was the first true no-fault statute in the nation. For Robert, the step-by-step process shifted from proving guilt to certifying an irremediable breakdown of the marriage. This meant that for the first time in American history, the state acknowledged that a man's personal happiness and the health of the family unit were not served by forced domesticity. The historical trends that followed this legislative shift were seismic. In the decade after California's decision, 49 other states followed suit in various forms. This led to what sociologists and legal historians call the divorce revolution. For the American man, the primary potential outcome was the removal of the legal blackmail that had defined the previous century. No longer could a spouse hold a man's reputation hostage in exchange for an inequitable financial settlement. However, this new freedom came with a different set of complexities, particularly regarding the equitable distribution of assets. In historical fiction set during the 1970s and 80s, we see the battle move from the bedroom to the balance sheet. The focus was no longer on who did what, but on who owned what. Let us look at a case study of a man in 1975. Imagine if Robert had spent 20 years building a pension and a portfolio. Under the new no-fault laws, the court began to view marriage as an economic partnership. This was a radical departure from the 19th century doctrine of coverture. The man was no longer the sole owner of the marital estate. He was a co-partner. The step-by-step reality for Robert was a grueling audit of every cent earned during the marriage. This era introduced the concept of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, a legal tool that allowed a former spouse to claim a portion of a man's retirement savings. In the context of our masterclass, this represents the final shift from the man as a moral guardian to the man as a financial partner. The data from the late 20th century shows that as the legal barriers to divorce fell, the rates of contested litigation actually increased in the realm of child custody. This brings us to the rise of the joint custody movement. For centuries, as we discussed in earlier parts, the law swung between paternal rights and the tender years doctrine. In the 1970s, men began to organize and fight for the legal recognition of their roles as active, nurturing parents. Historical trends show that by the 1980s, joint legal custody became the preferred standard in many states. For the fictional male protagonist, this was a hard-fought victory. It meant he was no longer a visitor in his children's lives, but a permanent fixture, regardless of his marital status. This change reflects the 2026 reality where fatherhood is defined by presence rather than just provision. Furthermore, we must examine the legacy of the alimony reform. In the historical narratives of the early 20th century, alimony was often a life sentence for the man. In the wake of the no-fault revolution, the courts began to move toward rehabilitative alimony. The goal was no longer to punish the man or provide a lifetime pension for the woman, but to provide a temporary bridge until both parties could become self-sufficient. Case studies from the 1980s and 90s show a marked decrease in permanent alimony awards, reflecting a society that increasingly valued the economic independence of both genders. For a man like Robert, this meant that while the initial financial hit was significant, there was a visible end to his obligations, allowing for a true second act in his life. The impact of these changes on American historical fiction is profound. Modern writers looking back at the 20th century often focus on this era of transition. They portray the man of the 70s and 80s as a figure navigating a world where the old maps of masculinity no longer worked. He was free from the threat of the workhouse and the psychiatric clinic, but he was also forced to redefine his identity in a world that no longer automatically deferred to him as the head of the household. The transactional reality of the past had been replaced by a negotiated reality. As we stand in the year 2026, the evolution of divorce for men in American historical fiction serves as a mirror to our own progress. We see that the struggle for a fair and equitable dissolution of marriage was not just a legal battle, it was a cultural one. It was a centuries-long journey from the man as a state-sanctioned patriarch to the man as an individual with the right to pursue happiness, protect his children, and manage his own destiny. The potential outcomes today are vastly different than they were for Arthur in 1845 or Silas in 1870, but the echoes of those old laws still linger in our vocabulary and our storytelling. The masterclass has taken us through the legislative halls of the colonies, the frontier towns of the West, the dark cells of the workhouse, and the sterilized rooms of the psychiatric courts. We have seen men vanish, fight, lie, and ultimately transform. This journey through historical fiction isn't just about the end of marriages. It's about the birth of the modern American man. We have analyzed the data, explored the case studies, and stepped into the lives of those who lived through these legal shifts. But the story of the American domestic experience is never truly finished. As society continues to evolve, so too will the laws that govern our most intimate relationships. We are seeing new trends emerge in the 21st century regarding digital assets, international jurisdictional disputes, and the evolving definition of family itself. The questions that haunted the men in the 1800s are being asked again in new contexts. How much of our past do we owe our future? How does the law balance individual liberty with social stability? The deep dive into the archives has shown us that the unbreakable shadow of the first marriage is finally fading, replaced by a legal system that, while imperfect, at least attempts to see the human being behind the petitioner. We have closed the loop on 5 centuries of history. From the first legislative decrees to the latest joint custody rulings, the American man's path through the divorce court has been a long, slow walk toward the light. We have reached the end of our 10-part journey, but the analysis of how these stories shape our world continues. The masterclass is complete, yet the dialogue between our history and our future remains wide open.